by Bob Halliday. And Bob's qualifications for this is that he was a member of the IJC panel that looked at the Red River flood in 1997. I'll now turn it over to Bob.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Thanks for joining in. What I'm going to do is step through a number of slides covering the Red River Basin, flooding in general in the basin, and then I'll discuss some of the recommendations from the IJC review of flooding, and I'll finish up with a discussion of current day challenges and vulnerabilities related to flooding in the Red River Basin. As Rick mentioned, feel free to post questions and we'll deal with them at the end. I think we'll have enough time to do that. Just a brief background on the Red River Basin. It's kind of a medium-sized watershed. It's about 100,000 square kilometers. The notable feature of the river itself is that the slope is exceedingly low. The average slope over the entire length of the basin is 1/10 of a meter per kilometer, and it's actually a little steeper than that in the U.S. portion, and then it flattens out as it approaches the Canada-U.S. boundary. The basin, the river itself starts in South Dakota and does flow north, forming the boundary between North Dakota and Minnesota. In the photograph or in the slide, you can see the closed Red River, the closed Devil's Lake Basin that shows up in the kind of towards the Canadian border on the western part of the basin, and most of that area does not contribute naturally to the Red River flows. I should also note that the Red River is essentially unregulated. There are a few small dams and the tributaries, but essentially the river flows unregulated through to the Canadian border. It's a very significant agricultural area, and it's also contains most of the population of Manitoba, and namely in the city of Winnipeg and some other communities, and about 1/3 of the North Dakota population. So what happens in this basin is critical to those two jurisdictions, and of course Minnesota, it's a smaller play in Minnesota, but it's still an important part of Minnesota as well. So, and of course the international nature of the basin was what led to the IJC review of flooding in the basin, and which will be the subject of this discussion.
Bob, are you advancing your slides?
Yes, I am.
They're not showing.
Oh. Okay, now how do we...
Your main screen is still showing the 20 years after flood mitigation.
Oh, I'm well ahead of that now. Now how do I... Is there a way that something I can do, Rick, to...
On your screen, click through the... There we go. Now we're moving. IJC report highlights are up.
Okay.
Went back to the main screen.
Okay. So, is it showing outline now?
No, it's the main screen now. The 20 years after flood mitigation.
I know, I think I know.
There we go. Oops.
Does this work where it shows the Red River Basin?
No, don't have your screen at all now.
Worked so well yesterday, Rick.
There we go. Now we're seeing the basin.
Okay. And it's full screen for you?
Yes. You've got the thumbnails down the left, but that's...
Okay. Well, maybe I should just stick with this format as long as people can read the material.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. turning just to the next slide, is this is a LiDAR representation of the Red River Valley in the U.S. And that green and beige area in the center is the flat Red River Valley. Valley is not technically the right word, but it's known locally as the valley, and everybody talks about the Red River Valley as being that area. The other thing to note in this is that the tributaries of the Red River tend to just flow directly from the uplands into the Red River, and you don't see that typical dendritic pattern that you often do in many, many streams. So it's an unusual case in that respect. Turning now to the 1997 flood, this time 20 years ago, there was above normal soil moisture in the basin. There was a record to near record snowpack, and spring snowmelt was actually just getting going in the very south of the basin. And I should say that in the Red River Valley or Red River Basin, the floods are relatively predictable, at least the antecedent conditions for floods, and floods are sort of slow to rise and slow to recede. So people at this time of year know full well whether there's a high likelihood of a flood. But what really changed things in 1997 was a Colorado low that came out of the southwest United States and dropped a lot of rain, ice pellets, and snow, depending on where you were in the Red River Basin, around the beginning of April. And that, in effect, shut down the runoff that was already occurring. And then when it proceeded again, we ended up with a relatively short, sharp peak, which turned out to be the second largest flood in terms of flood elevation, the second largest flood on record certainly in the lower part of the basin. It wasn't a record flood in sort of the Fargo area. And this flood has been exceeded only by the one in 1826, which is a historic flood that was well documented. The volume of the 1997 flood was more or less the same as the legendary 1950 flood on the Red River, which was a much slower to rise and more extended flood. And post-analysis of the 1997 flood indicates that it was about a 1 in 100 year event. For those that indulge in statistical hydrology, the 1997 flood volume was thought to be about a 1 in 160 year flood event. So post-analysis of large events tends to lower the return period, and that's quite common. After the flood, the governments of Canada and the United States asked the International Joint Commission to examine the causes of the flood and to recommend ways of mitigating future flood events. And that led to a formation of a task force, of which I was a member, and ultimately an IJC report to governments. That report covers a number of items listed on the screen, but sort of preparing for the next flood, there were a number of environmental considerations. There was a pitch for more integrated planning related to flood management, and some discussion of institutional arrangements in the Red River Basin. The report had 27 conclusions, or 7 conclusions and 28 recommendations. Also, the task force had made a number of reports and a number of recommendations, and 30 of those were just accepted by the IJC and just reiterated in the report. When you examine all of those recommendations and where they are today, you get something like the pie diagram that I'm showing you. Of those recommendations, almost half of them are been completed. There's a large number, significant number that's been superseded by events, and I'll discuss some of those shortly. And then there are a number of recommendations that, in effect, would live for as long as the river runs. So, so when you sum it up, there's been very good progress on meeting the recommendations that were made 20 years ago. What's significant to me was that if you looked at the same sort of diagram 10 years ago, there was would have been much less progress. And I think one of the, it's kind of not a good thing to say, but one of the things that's allowed progress to continue regarding Red River flooding is there have been a number of floods since 1997, and people in the basin and governments, institutions are all well aware of the flood hazard and continue to make progress on trying to reduce flood risk to basin residents. So without those floods, post 1997 floods, governments could well have moved on to other priorities, but the continuing flooding situation is an issue, and people are seized by the need to continue to look at flood mitigation. The recommendations of the International Joint Commission covered a number of areas, but generally related to policies, legislation, and institutions in the Red River Valley, or in the Red River Basin, and then covered sort of the kind of emergency management cycle of preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of recommendations that had sort of an environmental context. And I'll just step through some of those now and share them with you. In the policy legislation area, some of you that were around at that time may remember that the federal government had a cockamamie policy. This is the Canadian federal government, I should say. Cockamamie policy about trying to sell taxpayer-supported data back to taxpayers, and the IJC took great exception to that policy, and it was discarded shortly after that. The U.S. government, on the other hand, has always had a very open policy of making government data and reports available to the public. That may be changing as we speak, but certainly in the days of the 97 flood, there was a dramatic difference in data availability between the U.S. agencies and Canadian agencies, and state and provincial as well. Also, following the Red River flood, the Manitoba government revised a designated flood area regulation they had to make the 1997 flood elevation a designated regulatory flood in the Red River Valley, and that's Red River Basin. That's been continued. The U.S. brought in a national flood mitigation program for flood risk, and following that, also Canada produced a national disaster mitigation strategy. I should say that the IJC can't take credit for all of these changes. They can take credit for identifying the need for some of these changes, and government should take credit for responding to those, but I don't think we can give IJC credit for all of them. In the U.S., there was changes in funding of mitigation measures, and also in the U.S., the state building codes were modified to deal with flood issues. So there are a number of different policies and legislation that were brought in. In terms of institutions, the IJC did advocate for a basin-wide institution to report on flood-related issues, and the IJC itself created an international Red River board that was comprised of sort of other boards that operated in the Red River Basin, but they brought them all together under one fairly large board that has water management and water quality type and issues to deal with, things like flood forecasting and so on. And then out of the Red River flood as well, there was a Red River Basin Commission developed, and it also was founded in earlier institutions, but the Red River Basin Commission is actually a binational grassroots kind of commission that meets and discusses Red River flood matters, and has made a number of significant proposals for flood mitigation and other water management issues in the Red River Basin. Other institutions were an academic, quasi-academic institution at the international, known as the International Water Institute at Fargo at the university, and that institute actually led in some of the work that was done post-flood on data acquisition and so on. There was also a Greenway Trust set up to try to lead to increased attention to riparian values along the Red River itself. So a number of different institutions arose from the flood and from the IJC recommendations. In terms of preparedness, there was a lot of development and enhanced development of emergency action plans on both sides of the border. The state and provincial requirements were vastly improved, and Winnipeg and Grand Forks, and I mentioned Roseau, Minnesota, of communities that really put a huge amount of effort into making an emergency plan that was meaningful and would work during all conditions. I'm not exaggerating too much, but some of the emergency plans 20 years ago were really skeletal and really didn't have much meat on the bones, and now that's changed quite a bit. The second area in terms of preparedness was a lot of attention to topography and documenting structures in the Red River Basin. The IJC led in the development of a LiDAR digital elevation model for the area south of Winnipeg, and this was at a time when LiDAR was expensive and it was also proprietary, and the IJC paid for LiDAR of that area and gave it to anyone who wanted it, and that kind of broke the back on proprietary LiDAR. Following that, the Red River Basin Institute led on the development of a LiDAR DEM for the entire Red River Basin in the US part of the basin, so that's total LiDAR coverage. In Manitoba, the so-called Red River Valley is well documented by LiDAR, but the uplands still doesn't have LiDAR coverage. Also, a key item in related preparedness was flood forecasting, and the U.S. National Weather Service went to an ensemble forecast routine, which was quite a change from earlier forecast methods and earlier forecast products, and also what's now Manitoba Infrastructure developed improved flood forecasting methodologies as well. And a lot of the work since the 1997 flood has tended to be increased data acquisition, and I'm going to talk more about flood forecasting later in this presentation. Moving on to mitigation, there was a very large number of, if you like, mitigation opportunities in the Red River Valley, and it's led for anywhere from individual farmstead ring dikes and building raises to community dikes. There's a little bit of upstream storage in parts of the United States, and one enormous project was the floodway expansion in the city of Winnipeg. The IJC, in effect, recommended that Winnipeg should be protected against the 1826 flood or greater, and the 1826 flood was roughly a 1 in 300 year event. And the rationale for this was just the significance of a city of Winnipeg to the Manitoba economy. You know, it comprises more than half the Manitoba population and well over half of the Winnipeg economy, and if Winnipeg goes down, the whole provincial economy goes down. And I should say in 1997, the Winnipeg escaped disaster by literally millimeters. It was a very, very close call, and there's a lot of hard work and good work done to keep Winnipeg dry in 1997. And it was just felt that the risk was just too great, and so the floodway expansion project was initiated. Similarly, Grand Forks and East Grand Forks were devastated by the 1997 flood, and that devastation led to reorientating the whole downtown of East Grand Forks and a very significant Corps of Engineers levee project in the city of Grand Forks. And the interesting thing about both of these projects is that the economic decision for the level of protection for the project design was based on when the cost-benefit ratio of increased flood protection led to $1 of benefit to an increased dollar in cost. So it was where the cost-benefit curve started to level out. And the the end result is that Winnipeg's design flood was in the order of 1 to 700. It's that's I put the caveat on it because that assumes that you can operate the area upstream of Winnipeg as kind of a floodway forebay, and it's almost a reservoir operation. So it's dependent on the volume as well as the peak flood that comes down. And the Grand Forks project ended up with about a 1 in 250 year flood protection. Another big project which was recommended but is just getting underway now is a Fargo-Moorhead diversion, which would protect the city of Fargo, which is North Dakota's largest city and again an economic driver in that jurisdiction. And that project is underway but still more in construction, and it's actually being developed as a P3 project. Moving on to some of the non-regulatory and non-structural type mitigation efforts, the regulatory floodplain in Manitoba and the U.S. was, as I mentioned earlier, the Manitoba floodplain was upped a considerable amount. The U.S. still maintains the 1 in 100 floodplain as a regulatory floodplain. The other thing that took place following the 1997 flood was considerable effort on hydrodynamic models. Part of this is the result of having data, LIDAR data, to provide a topography, and also the need to examine some of these structural measures carefully with hydrodynamic models. And both one-dimensional and two-dimensional hydrodynamic models were used and developed to deal with some of the mitigation efforts. At one point, Manitoba had a hydrodynamic model that actually would create the number of sandbags you'd need to protect your building, and it was kind of expensive to maintain, and actually, as it turned out, most of the farmsteads and small communities in Manitoba were protected by levees and raises and moves of one kind or another. Following the 1997 flood, something like 1,700 structures were raised in the Manitoba floodplain, raised, moved, or diked, and there were similar projects in the United States. Another mitigation item relates to ice management, and north of Winnipeg, there's actually a record of over 150 years of ice jam flooding north of Winnipeg, and the Manitoba government bought equipment for cutting the ice in the spring and moving ice around, and during a spring flood event. So there's quite an extended use of ice management north of Winnipeg following the flood. In terms of response recovery, the main efforts there in Canada related to what's known as JEP, Joint Emergency Preparedness Program, operated by the federal government and the provincial government, and the effort was put into flood communications and emergency rescue. There are also a number of different flood response exercises in the U.S., and ultimately an MOU was signed between Canada and the U.S. for international emergency assistance, which would allow movement of goods and services across the border in a flood emergency. And so there was some effort in this response recovery area, but a large amount of the effort was devoted to emergency or to mitigation. Finally, on the environment, there are several different items, but Lake Traverse is a reservoir in the very upstream part of the basin, and there's actually an opportunity there for biota to move from the Mississippi River into the Red River, and there's some concern about biota transfer, and there's a little town known as Browns Ferry in the headwaters, which when flood mitigation works are provided at Browns Ferry, the biota transfer issue can be dealt with to some extent. In Manitoba, there were a number of groundwater wells contaminated by the flood, and a fair bit of attention was devoted to that. In terms of hazardous goods, there's actually a a banned substance stored in a warehouse in the U.S. that found its way into Lake Winnipeg, and this was toxaphene, and the Lake Winnipeg was monitored for toxaphene for many years after the flood until the level dropped off. Governments have made stronger efforts to control hazardous goods in floodplains, but as I mentioned earlier, the Red River floodplain can be up to 40 kilometers wide in Manitoba. So controlling hazardous goods, and this could be even agricultural chemicals or fertilizer storage and so on. There are rules on hazardous goods. They're not related specifically to the floodplain, but governments have stepped up their rulings on hazardous goods. The other issue on Lake Winnipeg related to nutrient fluxes from these large floods, and as you can imagine, a major flood in the Red River Basin washes both phosphates and nitrates into Lake Winnipeg, and that lake is challenged by eutrophic processes in any event. So dealing with Lake Winnipeg water quality post-flooding has been a very significant challenge. Other things that came up were many sewage lagoons, of course, weren't designed to be at that Red River 1997 flood level, and so the protection for sewage lagoons had to be upped as well, and the new regulatory floodplain in Manitoba takes care of some of those issues. I mentioned the Greenway development. The Greenways were installed as part of the Red River flood mitigation, the Grand Forks flood mitigation works and the expanded floodway in Winnipeg. And there's some other efforts going on to develop greenways along the Red River that help protect riparian valleys. And also the Red River in Manitoba was declared a national heritage river following that flooding event, and so that leads to some better consideration of riparian values as well. In the United States, they have a agricultural program related to conservation reserves, which in effect allows farmers to receive a benefit by putting the Red River floodplain into a permanent cover. And so in effect, up to the 100-year flood could be put into permanent cover, and farmers in the United States would get a benefit by doing so. And there's some similar programs have been looked at in Manitoba, but Manitoba will give some tax abatements for those kind of projects, but they won't actually pay significant amounts of money. In the U.S., the amount of money for putting your land into a conservation reserve can equal or come close to equaling the value of the land, so it's very significant. Let's move on to challenges and vulnerabilities. First of all, it's clear that the Red River Basin post 1997 is vastly more resilient than it was, prior to the 1997 flood. And a very significant flood can take place now in the Red River Valley with very little damage and relatively little flood fighting costs. There's recommendations of the IJC that have been taken over by events include the Canadian data policies. Those were changed. The other interesting thing that we discovered was that the Americans had changed their vertical datum to an Earth-centered datum in prior to 1997, whereas Canada still had a mean sea level based datum. So in effect there was a vertical datum, and in effect there was kind of a little bit of a speed bump at the border, but when you realize that the slope of the Red River Basin is only a few centimeters per kilometer, datums become very important. But in 2013, Canada adopted a datum that's now the same as the U.S. datum, and the two datums are compatible, and that makes some of these modeling challenges just that much easier, and leads to less likelihood of errors in vertical datum when you're looking at modeling the Red River Basin. The other thing that's very significant is we're now in the era of big data, and you know, people, hydrologists and other water resources practitioners can, you know, work with terabytes of data, and LIDAR is becoming ubiquitous. And in the days of the 1997 flood, I don't think I'm exaggerating too much to say that you know, 2D models, hydrodynamic models, ran slower than real time. So, you know, and so modeling and the modeling environment has changed very significantly. And a lot of recommendations of the IJC related to modeling, and literally those recommendations have been taken over by events. In terms of some of the institutional matters, one of my little hobby horses is that the, although the U.S. model building code contains flood-proofing guidance and instruction, the National Building Code of Canada still doesn't. And if you ask the question, the answer you get is that people shouldn't live in floodplains. But I'm sorry, millions of Canadians do live in floodplains, and having a building code that doesn't deal with flooding issues just makes no sense to me. The other element that could be addressed is the how to deal with critical infrastructure, and it makes very little sense to have critical infrastructure in the regulatory floodplain. And you know, if people are going to be evacuated to schools and the schools are in the floodplain, that's not very helpful. And so that's another challenge for flood managers in this basin. Another item is in Canada is the Disaster Financial Assistance Program, which in effect allows somebody who's been damaged by floods to rebuild what was damaged. And it means that unless the building codes change or the regulations change, like the safe building elevation, disaster financial assistance just restores what was there before. And it would make sense, for example, if you're rebuilding a house in the Red River Valley to you know, put tornado straps on the roof, or if you're rebuilding a flood-prone dwelling in Calgary to put a hail-proof roof on it. But DFAA just doesn't allow that kind of stuff to happen. And it's also very difficult to fund buyouts of flood-prone properties under the Canadian rules, and difficult to deal with repetitive flooding. So there's still room for a scope on improving how those programs deal with flooding. Another challenge relates to the just the very nature of flooding in the Red River Basin, and this might apply anywhere in Canada and the United States as well. But in following the 1997 flood, there was a decent flood in 2006, and that's, you know, roughly 10 years later, and we found that almost no damage arose during that flood, and it certainly proved that the mitigation efforts post-1997 had been quite successful in making the valley more resilient. And then in 2009, another flood came along, and this one actually became the flood of record in the Fargo, North Dakota area. Fargo still hasn't had a 1 in 100-year flood, but 2009 became the flood of record. It was higher than 2007. And also in the Manitoba part of the basin, 2009 led to a number of ice-affected issues, and that was when Manitoba sort of upped its game in dealing with ice effects and managing floods under ice conditions. And so 2009 was a different breed of cat, but it was still led to additional activity and aimed at making communities in the Red River Basin more resilient. And then in 2011, the issue there was the flood volume. This became the largest volume flood. I'm not sure if somebody can correct me on this, whether it would have equaled the 1826 flood volume, but it certainly equaled and exceeded the flood volume in the instrumental record of Red River flooding up to this time. And from Winnipeg, this was also a challenge in the sense of the Assiniboine contribution, which people recall was a huge amount of water coming in from the Souris River from Saskatchewan through North Dakota and up to the Assiniboine, and then a lot of Assiniboine flooding related to Qu'Appelle River in Saskatchewan and the Assiniboine itself in Manitoba. So managing the Assiniboine contribution at a time of a high, but you know, if it had been just a Red River flood in Winnipeg, they could have managed fairly well, but managing that Assiniboine contribution was a real challenge. And again, it showed the way floods can change and how each flood becomes its own challenges. The other issue about the nature of flooding relates to climate change, and you know, we're seeing a particularly wet summer period now in this part of the Canada and the U.S., and so it's likely that there'll be seasonal factors that'll have to be taken into account as you address flooding in the Red River Basin. And the current flood forecast models tend to relate to snow and ice melt with some precipitation during that spring breakup period. But you know, we're starting to see summer flooding. There was at least one freeze-up flood in Manitoba since the 1997 flood, and so I think with climate changes, we'll find that it won't be just spring flood that you have to deal with in the Red River Basin. There could be other floods as well, and that provides new challenges for flood forecasting and floodplain management. Another challenge remains the whole question of mitigation, and the basin has been is very flood-proof. There's no question about that. But Fargo, Moorhead still needs some attention, and there are also some very small communities that simply can't afford to implement the floodplain management measures that are needed, and even if you consider just a 1 in 100 flood, and so some flood protection is unaffordable. The other challenge related to depending so much on structural measures to avoid flood damages is that you can say that at some point, no matter what structural measure you put in, its design flood will eventually be exceeded. And you know, the major centers in the Red River Basin have very significant flood protection measures now, but someday they will be exceeded, and certainly the smaller communities will have that challenge more often, as most of the time their flood protection measures are in the order of the 1 in 100 year flood. And so you know, I think we need ongoing consideration of how to manage non-structural measures and make the basin even that much more resilient in the face of damaging floods. And just one more thought on some other challenges and vulnerabilities. You know, there were significant changes to flood forecasting made after 1997, but you know, flood forecasting has moved along considerably in what can be done. And I think there was rapid changes at post-1997, and now I think there's an opportunity to incorporate hydrological processes to a much greater extent than are currently in the flood forecasting models, and that's including things like getting a better grip on antecedent precipitation, managing snow and blowing snow, and dealing with the energetics of spring breakup or spring runoff, just understanding that whole question in much more detail. And then there are opportunities as well now for incorporating remotely sensed data. You know, there's NOAA's SNODAS snow data database, and I think for the most part, the Red River Basin still depends on point data for its flood forecasting, and kind of there's I think a new generation of forecast opportunities come along that could be very, very helpful. I think the other area that can still be looked at is decision support, and that can be things like improved models, but it's also data visualization that would help floodplain managers deal with evacuation issues and a whole host of things that when you have to make decisions during a flood event. And I think decision support tools that the public would benefit from, and planning, taking personal responsibility for their flooding situation, and also in reacting appropriately during a major event. There's also an issue of transboundary basins, and some of you may have heard of there are two transboundary basins, tributaries to the Red River flood basin, and one is the Pembina River, which comes in, rises in Manitoba, loops through the U.S., and joins the Red River just south of the Manitoba boundary. And then the Roseau River that comes in from the east and rises in Minnesota and comes through into Manitoba. And the Pembina River basin has been the subject of a long and contentious dispute between Manitoba and North Dakota. And the basis of the dispute is what's known as the road dike in Manitoba along the international boundary, and I guess it's a road if you're North Dakotan, it's a dike if you're North Dakotan, it's a road if you're Manitoban. But it's a very contentious issue that has gone on for literally generations. The current level of modeling allows that lower Pembina basin to be modeled very, very precisely, and we're hoping that that model can lead to some consensus on what the solution to the problem is. The challenge, I think, is that some solutions will work well in one year and not in another, and it's to get people together to make a decision on what's the best solution is going to be a real challenge. But in both of these transboundary basins, where I think the flooding issues should be top of mind for the IJC, because that's the transboundary region, is what the IJC is concerning itself with, and that's one where the IJC itself can devote some effort and its good offices to trying to achieve a solution. And I'd like to just leave you with one thought, and then we'll open it up for questions. And this is a quote which I hope you can read, but it's as true now as it was in 1880 when Sir Sandford Fleming wrote about Red River flooding. And Fleming was the man who really documented the 1826 flood and some of the big floods of the 1800s. And so I'll leave it with that and open it to questions, Rick, if you want.
Okay, thank you, Bob. At this time, I ask the audience to type any more questions, comments you may have. I'll give you a couple of moments to do that while I talk about what's going on. A follow-up email containing a link to download the PDF of today's slides will be distributed to everybody who's online in the coming days. As always, we appreciate your feedback. The next Saskatchewan branch webinar will be Tuesday, April 7th, and Dr. Dave Soshin will be talking about climate change and water at that time. But on Thursday of this week, we have a Manitoba presentation, Strategies for Implementing Green Infrastructure, which will be at noon Alberta time, 1 o'clock Manitoba or Saskatchewan time. Now, questions. Slide 18, Bob. 2011 flood here in Manitoba is seen as a flood in the western part of the province rather than a Red River flood. Most Winnipeggers wouldn't even remember a flood, might remember higher water here in Winnipeg, and might remember 2011 for the flooding in Brandon and the Portage River diversion. Lake Manitoba flooding. Can you comment?
Yes, in fact, if it had been just the Red River flooding in 2011, I think Manitobans really wouldn't have noticed. But the flood itself on the Red was significant, and what made it challenging for the city of Winnipeg was the enormous flood from the west, and this applied not only in Manitoba but also North Dakota. And so the 2011 is remembered for the Assiniboine and other flooding. I think I'm right in saying too that on the Souris River in Saskatchewan, that was almost 1 in 500 year flood. on the Souris. So it was an enormous flood. But 2011 wasn't trivial in Manitoba either. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's 2011 on the Red River would probably still make the top 10 list of floods in the instrumental record on the Red River itself.
Thank you, Bob. Can you comment on the number of homes being built in the Red River Valley south of the city of Winnipeg? Is another question.
Yeah, and Manitoba has, I should have mentioned, and I forgot that Manitoba now has a regulatory flood of the 1 in 250 flood throughout the province. And when you go south of Winnipeg, homes are on very large elevated mounds, and it's a way of getting above the floodwaters. Manitoba still requires that during a flood, because you're denied access to your house, you have to evacuate. But it means that very large floods can move up south of Winnipeg and not cause damages. You know, the challenge, I think, is there is higher ground in and around Winnipeg, and I wonder if people building in those flood-prone areas, because they still are going to be subject to inconvenience, even if they're not subject to damages. But I think that Manitoba is requiring them all to be built above the 1 in 250 flood level, and but it is a curious thing when you drive south of Winnipeg to see the prairie pingos with houses on them.
I have a comment from somebody that it's the 1 in 200 year.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I apologize. 1 in 200 year flood is now the regular flood in Manitoba. I think BC is 1 in 250.
Probably should be 1 in 250, but would you have a comment, further comment on the building code for floodplains because of the coming federal floodplain management guidelines that are coming out and the webinar and workshops that we're working on?
Yeah, like Canada, like the U.S., has a national model building code, and it's up to provinces to adopt that building code and make that part of a provincial code. So it's like everything else in Canada. It's a complicated federal-provincial process that leads to the national building code. And my sense is there just isn't any enthusiasm for including flood-proofing measures in the National Building Code of Canada. And the U.S. has done it, and I guess but I wouldn't say just adopt the U.S. provisions, because there are unique situations that apply to Canada as well. But I just don't know what the inertia is there, but it looks like there's no enthusiasm either in some provinces or at the federal level for including flood-proofing measures. And some of these flood-proofing measures are relatively simple. You can, hang a furnace from the floor joists of your first floor rather than having it on the floor of a house. And but we see time and time again when houses are flooded in Canada, people now keep more and more stuff in the basement. They're you got the $1,000 TV down there and a whole bunch of other things, and but there are some very simple measures that could be taken to help flood-proof that house. Winnipeg, of course, has a requirement for backflow preventers on all of their floor drains in Winnipeg, and things like that are simple, straightforward, and could be required from building codes for any floodplain dwelling, and yet it's just not being done in Canada.
Yeah, another question. In Manitoba, which level of government owns, operates, and maintains the dikes and levees as well as the floodway at Winnipeg?
The provincial government, for the most part, is the owner of the floodway, and they are the ones that make the operating rules for the floodway. The internal levees and dikes and secondary levees in Winnipeg are owned by the city, But there's also, if I'm not mistaken, and someone from Manitoba can correct me, there is a provincial diking commissioner who has, I think, the authority to inspect dikes and make recommendations for improvements throughout the province. But in my understanding is that generally, like say these communities, there are about 17 communities south of Winnipeg that have ring dikes around them, and those dikes are owned by the province, but I think the communities make a contribution to maintaining them. And I hope I'm right in that, but again, someone from Winnipeg might correct me.
Okay. With the advent of flood insurance in Canada, which is now possible for residences, which wasn't during the previous floods, do you think that's going to have an impact on creating an urgent need for the building code revisions?
If I was an insurer, I would certainly be pressing to have building codes that deal with flooding. And you know, the U.S. has, for many, many years, has operated a subsidized flood insurance program operated by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And in effect, Canada's been operating a subsidized flood insurance program backed by disaster financial assistance arrangements. But I'm not sure how the private sector flood insurance will work out. But if I was a private sector insurer offering flood insurance, I would like to feel that houses are being built to a certain standard when they're in a floodplain. And I think that could be a pressure to improve the building code in that respect. I await to see how, you know, whether insurers will in fact insure houses that are clearly flood prone. You know, you're in a 100-year floodplain, and you know, insurers will insure against known risks like death, but I'm not sure how you deal with insuring against a known risk when somebody's in a 100-year floodplain. And I should add that you know, a typical floodplain map shows a boundary that says 100-year floodplain, but if you're halfway between that boundary and the river, you're probably in the 50-year floodplain or something. So these are high-risk scenarios, and just how the insurance industry will insure them at some sort of reasonable premium, I don't know. The U.S. You know, as I say, does subsidize this. They say they don't, but they really do, and because the flood risk is determined by the U.S. federal government, and all the mapping is done by the U.S. federal government, and also the program has a considerable deficit. So just how the private sector insurance companies will handle things like determining risk, developing premiums, and dealing with building code issues, I just don't know.
Climate change is leading to higher fall moisture, more variable snowpacks, heavier precipitation, new melt rates, etc., etc. Given projections associated with climate change, how reliable are the flood frequency estimates that we've been referring to?
The quick answer is not very. You know, an article in, I think it was either in Science or Nature some years ago, and the title of the article was "Stationarity is Dead." And truly, and when it comes to floodplain management, stationarity never was really alive. But you know, up till 20 years ago, people had a fair bit of confidence in flood frequency analysis as a way to develop some sense of the flood hazard. And I think as years go by, that flood frequency analysis gets more and more problematic. And I think that's going to be a challenge for the future. And I think hydrologists will come up with some workarounds. But I remember the person who I learned all my flood frequency analysis from was a master by the name of Bob Conde. And Bob said, when you've completed your analysis, add a couple of feet for freeboard. And I think, you know, we really have to come up with a way of dealing with flood risk. And we can do heavy-duty analysis, but we have to be aware that that's an indication of a flood risk, and we need to take some proactive measures to deal with it as well. And perhaps history of flooding is going to be that much more important. I think as these unusual floods occur, we're going to have to say, okay, let's transpose that storm from point A to point B and see what it would mean on that environment. And I think we have to get more creative rather than just sticking with the standard flood frequency analysis approach.
Right. Does anybody else have any other questions? There are some other webinars coming on flooding, actually. We have strategies for implementing green infrastructure, as I mentioned, which is a Manitoba production on the 9th. On March 21st, we have the town of Canmore talking about lessons learned from the 2013 floods. That's from noon till 1 p.m. Alberta time. And on the 22nd, we have the Federal Floodplain Mapping Guidelines series presentation by NRCan and Public Safety Canada, again at 12 noon Alberta time. And Manitoba is planning on March 22nd having a continuation of their webinar series at 2 p.m. in the afternoon Alberta time. And on the 23rd, we have a French language production of the Floodplain Mapping Guidelines. So we have a very intense webinar series of events coming, and they're available on CWRA's website for links. I encourage you all to go there. And in closing, I'd like to thank Bob very much for his presentation and invite you to join us for future presentations. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Questions? Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
And with that, I'll stop the recording.